I guess we'll start by thinking about Marx in terms of his relationship with his philosophical predecessors. So, what is Marx's relation to his philosophical predecessors, and which philosophical influences loom largest in Marx's thought? Paul, would you like to start us off?
I can try. It's a difficult question, not because we don't know what Marx read and what he liked and didn't like. He was very good at not liking things in particular, but because I think it's probably right to say he didn't think of himself as a philosopher or carrying on a philosophical tradition only. In fact, the way he came back to philosophy in the 1850s was because he found a need for a souped up logic while he was doing what he really wanted to do, which was um, trying to move the needle on an anti-capitalist struggle, which he had done in a number of ways. He was an activist, he was an organizer, he was a journalist. Um, he did something like we would call political economy, something we would call sociology, all of these things. Another reason it's a vexed question, maybe I'll just say why I think it's a vexed question and then pass it on to the others, is that if you think of philosophy as a kind of zoologically, there's a cage where the philosophers go in the zoo called the university. It's not clear that Marx would fit in any of those cages. The sociology cage, he could be a literary critic, he could go in that cage. In a sense, he moves through all of them, and then the people in them want to kick him out.
Is it all right if I sort of jump in on that? Because,
Yeah,
um,
absolutely.
yeah, I think Paul, especially your observation that he's very good at disliking things is, of course, totally correct, and maybe also a sort of point of departure from which to think about his relationship to philosophy. Because there's the big guys, like there's Hegel, there's Aristotle. Of course he's influenced by Epicurus, which is less well understood, but he's sort of responding to these sorts of giants. But also, he is very influenced by what he dislikes and what he dislikes often specifically about philosophy, which I think is precisely what does vex this question of to what extent is he a philosopher, and what kind of role does philosophy have to play. But one of the things that I think is interesting to think about, for example, is I think that there's a good argument to be made that in some of his later work, he's heavily influenced by Max Stirner, the anarchist author that Marx dedicates hundreds of pages to carefully dismantling, right, in what's collected as the critique of the German ideology. Yet, we never talk about this sort of thing, So I think that he's heavily influenced by the utilitarians to which he's responding, people like Bentham and John Stuart Mill, although obviously he doesn't go and become a utilitarian, right? But if you want to understand something about Marx's own views about philosophy and about ethics, then you got to ask, well, why not? And it turns out he has much to say on the topic. So I think having a really broad view and including, right, those philosophers that he's critiquing, but also getting into why does he dislike them, I think that's exactly right, that's part of the story here.
Thanks, Vanessa. Sandro, do you have any thoughts on this question? Have you studied Marx's engagement with any of his philosophical predecessors beyond, say, Hegel?
Yeah, well, besides the ones that they already named, I will name also like the importance that has for Marx the French materialism, right? I mean, even in I think it's a very important source of engagement, no, in critical engagement with French materialism, no. But also I will say like, I don't know, like this this debate about if Marx was or was not a philosopher. I think the important thing for me, it will be more like, I mean, it's obviously that he take a lot of tools of philosophy, and he's in all his periods. Obviously, he's engaged he's engaged in a in a critical reading of philosophers. But I would argue that his main critique is more like to the traditional field of philosophical discourse, more than to philosophers as such, no?
So what was it that he was taking philosophy to task for? What was the main problem that he had with the broad status of philosophy at the time, Sandro?
I mean, there are some different stages for me in his critique of philosophy. But let's say, for example, he from early 40s, for example, he was very critic about this, let's say, philosophical utopism. I mean, he rejects a lot like philosophers' attitudes of having everything solved on the table, no? For instance. But also, I mean, I will say like one of the central points of his critique to philosophical discourse, we can find it on the thesis on Feuerbach, for example, no? But also, I mean, this this idea of the negation of philosophy, we need to remember that it was formulated during the early 40s, not just by Marx, but also by the other young Hegelians, right? By Feuerbach, by Stirner, by Bauer. And in a broader sense, as we know, some of the more important philosophers of 20th century have argued that they were not doing philosophy at all, no? So, yeah.
Super. So yeah, we talked a little bit about the inheritance, obviously.
Is it all right if I just, because I just wanted to pick up on something that Sandro
Yeah,
just
absolutely.
mentioned, because yeah, I mean, I think that's all exactly right. And one of the second, so like there's one thesis on Feuerbach that is more famous than the rest, right? But the one that I find myself thinking about most often lately is the second thesis, where he says that the this-sidedness of our thinking can be proved only in practice. And I think that really does, I would almost say that encapsulates like the whole critique of philosophy, right? That philosophy can identify questions for us and it can help to clarify our concepts, right? But if what we want is to get at reality, get at the objective truth, that's something that we're not going to be able to resolve, that question of whether our ideas reflect an objective external world by just having more ideas, right? We've got to be interacting with the world and seeing what we are able to bring about and what that says about how well our ideas mirror the world, and maybe even vice versa. So I think, I just wanted to echo that and build in along one of the lines that Sandro raised.
Can I also
Vanessa,
leap in? Do you mind?
yeah, Paul, please go for it.
We might just take this over, Anthony. I'm sorry. I want to ask Vanessa a question. As a philosopher, would you say that what Marx calls the this-sidedness of philosophy, or the problem with Feuerbach and other Hegelians, that they forgot the world, that's a trait of philosophy in general, or is there a kind of philosophy which starts with the world, and it had kind of gone down a wrong alley with Hegel, let's say, or others? I mean, in a sense, if you ask, is Marx a philosopher, you're also asking, what is philosophy?
What the hell are philosophers doing? Right?
What are philosophers
Exactly.
doing?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I will eventually put this question back to you because I'm also curious for your thoughts on this, and Sandra's as well, you know. And Anthony, we might get you. Um, but so I don't think it is an inherent trait of philosophy in general to be sort of unconcerned with the world. Um, but I think the sort of methodological point about whether, regardless of how much we might ask about the world or be interested in the world or be trying to say something about the world, can philosophy do that while remaining divorced from praxis, right? From the, I mean, the, one of the things that I um, say in my book, you know, is that the in the end the like Marx's methodology, like his understanding of how it is that we can come to understand the world, ourselves, our sociality as human beings, the methodology is revolutionary like practice. Like that is the methodology. Attempting to bring the world under or better, you know, bridge and abolish this separation, right, gap, alienation, right, between ourselves and the world, which is something that can only be done by humanizing the world and understanding ourselves as part of it, as a kind of active conscious part of it, right? um and so I don't think that philosophy as a whole, you know, has a sort of universal inherent problem with caring about the world, but I think where and I think this goes to the point about these cages. I mean, you used the word cage earlier, and which I think is very astute here, because that the problem is when philosophy wants to remain in its cage and be divorced from these other disciplines and from the practice of changing the world. That is when you run into all sorts of problems and are doing something that can never, I think, really rise to the level of knowledge or scientificity.
Could respond really briefly. That's great. I totally agree, which is unusual for Marxists, we'll say.
Right.
So far, we agree. Yeah. And maybe I'll bring in, so you brought up praxis as a kind of, you know, the theses on Feuerbach is interesting. These are, in a sense, philosophical premises
Mhm,
against a certain mode of philosophizing that forgets praxis.
mhm,
But it's not just a philosophical premise, the premise on praxis. It actually is to say, well, we need to do a theoretical philosophy that focuses on praxis. What you're saying also is you need to actually do the praxis, which Marx
mhm,
was quite good at. He
mhm,
did that, maybe in a way first he did the praxis,
mhm.
and then came back to philosophy after having been quite disappointed in it in college. Not the experience of your students, I'm sure. I think mine either.
Let's hope.
Let's hope. But praxis has a couple of interesting wrinkles for him as opposed to Aristotle. One is that I'll bring up the sixth thesis. I don't actually know them all, but the sixth thesis in which instead of an individual, the subject of praxis is a kind of social, interdependent social body, society is the subject of praxis.
Mhm.
So immediately you have a kind of challenge to a Socratic type of philosopher who could stand up in society and say,
Yes.
you know, the individual has to know themselves or has to know the good. The individuals are imbricated in this funny collective already. So what is philosophy in that case? And the other thing you brought up is really interesting, that philosophy, at least in the Socratic model, is about knowledge and not about change. So to imagine that the aim of philosophy is not to produce truth, because the truth doesn't yet exist, but to make the world in the image of a better world. Maybe that's a Platonic move, but it seems more radical in Marx's hand. A whole other science, critical theory was born from that, where you say, the aim is not to say the way the world is constitutively, but to show how we can break the bonds that hold us. So these are the possibilities for understanding Marx as a philosopher, but it requires you to think philosophy differently.
I want to say something about the thesis on Feuerbach, like grasping from Lucien Goldman. No, I think Lucien Goldman is one of the main authors of 20th century to give a very important place to thesis on Feuerbach. No, he actually in an essay that calls German Ideology and Thesis on Feuerbach, he actually sees thesis of Feuerbach as constituting like one of the main turning points in Western thought, no? And he says that like he believed that he's justified in affirming that its historical importance of the thesis on Feuerbach is in the same order as that of the discourse of method, the critique of pure reason, or the phenomenology of spirit, right? So it's very interesting, this point of view, because it's like I think Goldman is one of the Marxists that take like the thesis like to be so much like very important to the let's say the theoretical revolution that Marx is unfolding from that time, from thesis on Feuerbach and German ideology to the critique of political economy, no? Like trying to see like what is that is connecting the critique of thesis on Feuerbach to the development of the methodology of the critique of political economy. And in that sense, for example, Bolívar Echeverría, that it was Latin American Marxist that he actually studied in Germany in the 60s, and he was engaged in all the pre-68 movement in Berlin with Rudy Dutschke and all the groups that were evolving there. He goes even further, like seeing thesis on Feuerbach as, I mean, mainly thesis one. It will be for him like the most important of all the theses. And in this first thesis, we could see like a critique of the double horizon of bourgeois discourse, the double horizon that theoretical bourgeois discourse have to grasp what reality is, to grasp what objectivity actually is, no? So it's this critique to idealism and materialism, the beginning of the theoretical revolution, no, of Marx. But also I want to say, like, obviously we know that this debate about the relation between Marx and philosophy, it tends to divide or split in two main positions, right? First, those who deny that Marx practiced or engaged in philosophy, right? On the basis of his revolutionary commitment, but mainly on the basis of his self-conception of what he was doing. Because Marx was always saying, like, trying to overcome philosophy, the abolition of philosophy, and after that, like, going from the field of the philosophical discourse to the field of grounding a new scientificity, no, for the communist critical discourse, no. So we have this side in the first place, I think, and in the other hand, we have obviously people who are that obviously he was a philosopher because he studied philosophy, because his main influence were philosophers such as Feuerbach, Hegel, blah, blah, blah. And also because he obviously used a lot of, let's say, philosophical, theoretical tools in the development of the critique of political economy, no? And also there could be some people that take this to speak like in Engels terms, this new theoretical standpoint that will be like historical materialism as some kind of new philosophy. No, there are like some people that tend to look this development of the newest philosophical standpoint of historical materialism. But I will say also that we cannot lose from sight that in a certain sense, philosophical discourse, philosophical reflection, it's a non-optional enterprise, no?
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, for let's say like for the being who distinguish himself as a being who knows, there's no escape of philosophical reflection in the sense of that this being who knows, as part of what it is to know, has to know that knows, no? Like this sense of modern philosophy, no? Of not just trying to see the world outside and try to look for the essence of things, but also to look with to the tools that we have to understand the reality. No?
Mm-hmm.
But I will say that neither of these, let's say, positions about if Marx was a philosopher or was not a philosopher, it's fully like how you say, like it doesn't have the truth of all about this relation, no, of Marx and philosophy.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, I think there is something that is lost if we just jettison the idea of thinking about Marx as a philosopher and reading him as a philosopher. But then we also, I think, don't want to have a kind of reductive way of thinking of him as a philosopher, or imagining that his concerns, his arguments, and his way of presenting those arguments are going to neatly line up with what we expect to see based on the habits that we have, like the habits that academic philosophers today pick up. I think it's important not to try to assimilate him to a sort of 21st century analytic philosopher, but and I think on the other hand, there's that risk of reading him just as a philosopher. Like, one of the things that I am moved by when it comes to skepticism about thinking of Marx as someone with an important, whose work has an important ethical content, is the worry that then somehow his arguments for communism become reduced to just a matter of taste. Like, what do you feel more morally compelled to save the world or to be a billionaire? And it's up to you. Like, I think that that's a big mistake and a big kind of evisceration of what's going on in Marx, because one of the things that is really importantly going on with Marx, Marx and Engels say that they know a single science, and it's the science of history, right? And so that means that while it's useful to think about how their work, what their work contributes to various disciplines, how it is conversant with various disciplines. At the same time, we don't want to reduce him down to those disciplines the way we understand them, because that's not how he understood his own project. And I think, you know, Sandro, your point in pointing out that the materialist conception of history, part of what it is a kind of overcoming, right, of the way of bourgeois ways of organizing and seeking knowledge. And it's important to understand that there's something quite radically different about what Marx is doing, even while he was in conversation with us mere mortals who are philosophers and political economists and historians and scientists and so on. And it's important to understand him in that way as well. What's next, Anthony?
Well, I mean, there's so many threads. I mean, inevitably, a lot of them have gone in one ear and out the other. I suppose just maybe just to sort of go back a little bit. I mean, Ian put a question in the chat: was Marx really the first philosopher to propose changing the world? And it kind of made me think, was there something called political philosophy back in Marx's time, or is the whole idea of political philosophy something that really only kind of built up in the 19th century? Paul, was there a sort of discrete field? And if so, surely they were trying to change the world, or were they just doing very abstract political ruminations?
I mean, there was kind of theory of the state was a standard German discipline of the time, but mostly it tried to work out, you know, best form of government for certain ends and things like that. I think maybe the word we're missing to capture this is critique. There is a sense in which philosophy for Marx has to be critical. In a sense, that was the problem with Hegel for him. Certainly was the problem with Hegelians. It's not, but I think if you look back at the history of philosophy, and there are many histories of philosophy, and like the history of philosophy without gaps, which is a great idea, is really not just one history. There's many, many different branches that come off of many other branches. Um, and and even if you look at a certain Greek mythical origin, there's a critical intent. There's a social critical intent. Like, we are standing against the polis here. We are making a polis within the polis. This is the Socratic gesture. So there's an old, if not impetus to change the world, then at least to stand against it, to say, you know, here's the problems, we need to reflect on it. I guess I want to name one name that we passed by very quickly. I don't think we can go through this conversation without that, and that is Hegel. Just to say, in Marx's day, when he was coming up, philosophy meant Hegel. Hegel meant philosophy. There was only one philosopher. So when he writes about Epicurus and Democritus in his dissertation, he's really writing about Hegel and Schelling. You know, he read those things, but he was setting up a Hegel to beat a Schelling with a much more systematic view of nature that was dialectical. He didn't really understand Schelling, by the way. Could have, but didn't. Schelling is much closer to Marx than Marx understood. But so his battle about whether he was a philosopher or whether he wanted to do philosophy or what philosophy was really meant, could you do something as incredible as what Hegel did, which was also critical, at least in the philosophy of right. It was critical in the sense that it, against what a lot of other people thought the state was, it was going to set out what the state really was, without falling into certain pitfalls of the Hegelians, who he thought fell very short of Hegel in this way. What they thought doing philosophy was taking the philosophy of a philosopher and trying to make it actual in the world. Not actually philosophizing themselves, but taking Hegelian categories and saying, well, is the Prussian state really a perfect legal constitutional entity which negotiates all of its different interests in the Hegelian way? No. Marx critiques these beautifully in his dissertation. He says, no, well, that's not doing philosophy. That's taking a little problem with you where you don't understand Hegel well enough And you don't understand the world well enough to see that the world has its own logic and Hegel's logic goes beyond you. He thought these Hegelians were really small thinkers. So for doing philosophy, one thing we have to say for Marx meant doing something like Hegel did. There's a lot that can be said about that. And I think you could argue that he went on to do something like that with the system of capital later on. When he rediscovers Hegel's logic in the 50s, it's not so much that I don't think he applies the categories of Hegel's logic to capitalism, but he says, oh, there can be a much richer logic. And in fact, capital came to the main, what Marx thought was the main philosophical discovery of Hegel, abstraction. Capital came to abstraction way before Hegel did. So what we can do is a better Hegel, find the logic in this world system, what it shows us, which he read, by the way, not in Hegel, but in the factory inspector reports. He could tell how capital was working by looking at, empirical evidence of it. And then with the idea that there is a richer logic that he got from Hegel, he could develop that logic himself. So he is neither Hegel nor a Hegelian, but certainly very inspired by the grandeur of what Hegel could do.
Mhm. Yeah, one of the key themes, I would say, in the way that I think about Marx and in my book is this question of how Hegelian is Marx. And my answer is like pretty damn Hegelian. And I think that is important. I think that sometimes one of two things happens. Sometimes it's treated as an incredibly esoteric and arcane question with no real consequences for anyone. And sometimes these are two ways of being wrong about the relationship between Marx and Hegel, in my view. So there's one of them, and the other one is to think that maybe Hegel mattered quite a bit for Marx, but so much the worse for Marx. And so now the work of serious Marx scholarship is to drain the Hegelianism out of it and see what good is left. And I think that, I mean, listen, maybe that's right, but it's not going to help us understand what Marx himself is up to, because it seems to me that Marx very clearly thought of himself as building on the work of Hegel. I mean, he's explicit about it in exactly the ways that Paul just pointed to. And one of the reasons why I think that matters is that we talked about abstraction in Marx and materialism, but contradiction, right, is also extremely, I mean, one of the absolute central concepts in Marx, and and especially the idea that contradiction is not simply a feature of rival statements or something that exists in the sort of realm of ideas and concepts and theories, but rather is a feature of the external world itself, that there are existing simultaneously in the world and in the objects under our consideration opposing tendencies, opposing appearances and ways of manifesting, and that in capitalism, I mean, because Marx's central insight is both that is both like these observations about commodity exchange, observations about bourgeois society and its alienating tendencies relative to societies that preceded it, but also importantly, and this goes back to the question about change, that within capitalist society there exists this conflict, right? This contradiction, and that it's not just something that is theoretically imposed onto the whole. Oh, look, we could separate these groups into one that owns the means of production and one that doesn't and has their labor organized by the group that has got it all. That's not just sort of one frame among many, like here's a frame and maybe I'll choose a different frame. And what if you look at, no, his claim is that that's what's going on, that is what it is, that the central way of understanding this group of human beings that we call a species, but hasn't fully really come into being as one, is that it is divided into bourgeois and proletarians. There's other people in other classes, of course, but that this contradiction is what plays an outsized role in conditioning and determining the historical development of bourgeois society. And it's very difficult to capture that in a way that is true to Marx's understanding of the relationship between contradiction, historical change, and the ability to understand a large chaotic system as a single developing unity without Hegel. It's really hard, as you can tell, because nobody does it, and so like lots of things that Marx has to say about, the idea that one might be able to make some reasonable predictions about how such a system is likely to develop. The idea that that actually, if you attempt to see the world from the point of view of some universal interested subject without particular interest, which doesn't exist because all we got over here is bourgeois and proletarians, right? That you are automatically off on the wrong track when it comes to trying to understand what's actually going down, right? And the idea that by taking the interested perspective of the proletariat, that you actually put yourself in a position to see the world from the point of view of what Marx calls in the manifesto, the class with the future in its hands. All of that, I think it requires us not to sort of look askance, right, at the sometimes seemingly weird, I'll admit, weird things that Marx is borrowing from Hegel. And so, yeah, anyway, just wanted to sort of build on that point about we should talk a lot about Hegel.
So I guess as we move into the final bit of the conversation before we move to the questions from the audience, I guess the sort of most obvious kind of question to move to is, what does it mean to do philosophy after Marx and his critique of philosophy? I mean, to look at the latest point in the chat from Tara, she says, following on Vanessa's point about grafting Marx into contemporary academic categories, the very separation of knowledge into discrete disciplines and specialities is a kind of a bourgeois act, a retreat from totality. I mean, Sandro, you said when we were chatting beforehand that you did undergraduate degrees in history and sociology before doing a master's more in philosophy. So I guess you probably come at Marx from a chronically interdisciplinary framework. And Paul, you're in, I think, a French department, which I guess is also potentially German, sorry. Also potentially extremely interdisciplinary. It's kind of, you could presume you come at it. Vanessa, you're the only card carrying soul philosopher here, but I guess perhaps, as Tara alludes to in her comment, one of the things about doing thinking after Marx is maybe this sort of breaking down of these discrete categories. I mean, how do you see academic disciplines, Sandro? Do you see them as legitimate separations, or do you find that you feel like you're operating within lots of different ones and trying to pull them all together as much as possible?
I will say that that I try to engage with the order of the spontaneous scientific knowledge that this society produce, as actually Marx tries to do it, like from critique. No, you can do so. From my point of view, you can't do Marxist sociology or political philosophy, Marxist political philosophy. You have to do the critique of the spontaneous knowledge that this society produce and order in the scientific institutions, no, in the scientific split of knowledge. So yes, I think my standpoint is like to do the critique of sociology, not to try to do a Marxist sociology. You know what I mean? And I think this brings us like again to the revolution in theory that Marx is founding and then developing from thesis on Feuerbach to the critique of political economy. No? Like he kind of, well, from my point of view, he kind of understands like the theory of revolutions need a revolution in theory. And this revolution in theory implies like all this understanding of Marx that he cannot just propose in positive another kind of thoughts about the economy or another kind of society. That's why he was very, he always negate like this utopism and trying to give recipes of the new world to come. No, the only way to proceed is the critical discourse. No, I mean. The standpoint of the critique of political economy is in itself, in my opinion, it's in itself like what Marx can grasp, that it's the only methodological move that we can do when we are inside of ideology. I mean, because we are against ideology, but we cannot be outside the ideology. No, we are in the realm of social science, of philosophy in the academic world. We are already inside ideology. No, so you can get rid of ideology. The only way to confront is to confront via the critique of the knowledge that this society spontaneously develops to give an understanding of what it is. No, yeah.
Thanks, Sandro. Paul, how about yourself? What does it mean to do philosophy after Marx and his critique of philosophy? Not that you're strictly speaking thinking of yourself as doing philosophy, but like,
I would like
how's
to,
he
but
changed the
nobody,
intellectual landscape, especially vis-a-vis the philosophers of this world?
I think I would like someone to think of me as a philosopher, but nobody
I think of you as a
is
philosopher, but you
willing.
may not self-identify that way.
But
So
then this would be the problem. I think after Marx, it's hard to consider yourself a philosopher, to do something like philosophy. You would have to think of it, what does one do after Marx? Well, you work towards the best version of socialism you can. If philosophy is the thing that does that, and I think it can, some great American philosophers have done that. Charles Mills is one. Try to overcome differences and talk about how, certain sorts of differences are entrenched that would keep us from socialism. That would be one way to do it. Judith Butler is another one. But that would have to be philosophy's ultimate aim. So then you'd have to review what it means to do philosophy down into the sentences to say, well, is this helping us towards the real socialism, not the state socialism? So I don't know. I haven't figured out exactly how to do that, but I do have that impulse.
And how about you, Vanessa? How
Yeah,
chronically
I'm
interdisciplinary are you forced to be by virtue of your engagement with Marx? I mean, probably relative to your other colleagues in philosophy, you're kind of forced to be at least a semi-expert in a lot more related fields than they may be. So.
It's it depends on the philosopher. So like here at GW, I'm in a department with folks that are I think to a person very interdisciplinary in their interests. So it depends, I guess like what the person is doing, but I'm sorry, I'm just struck by the fact I'm like, this is interesting. Sandro and Paul have answers to this question, and I, um, I mean, because it's right. I mean, I guess I think about this question. I have less anxiety about it in the register of how to be a philosopher. I have more, or at least I represent it to myself more often in the form of the question how to be a moral philosopher, which is in some ways an even thornier question, right? And I, you know, I try. I think what's really important, and it goes to this question of interdisciplinarity, is to avoid approaching moral philosophical problems as though they can be resolved in the realm of thought, and to learn from what is happening outside, because Marx was a genius, was extremely well read, had a great collaborator in Engels. But ultimately, I think his most important contribution is that he is someone who was willing to be taught. And he was willing to be taught by the working class movements that were developing around him. He didn't see himself as someone who should identify for them what their aims should be or even their methods, right? He took himself to be gleaning something, right? Observing. I mean, comes back to approaching philosophy and approaching philosophical questions anyway with a scientific bearing and scientific perspective. And I think this is also what trips people up when they're asking I don't know why that lamp behind me just turned on. I'll figure it out in a moment. Um, but this is what trips people up with the philosophy question, I think, because philosophers, people basically think that a philosopher is like some sort of sagacious egghead, um, like in a ivory tower somewhere. Um, and they might not be all the way wrong about that, but what Marx is doing is not that. It is observing a living movement. It is seeing what it is that people are doing when they engage in struggles to survive, because at the end of the day, this is a theory of human flourishing, which requires human survival, right, as a basic precondition, which is the thing that capitalism imperils, right, which is the most important reason why capitalism is at odds with human flourishing, is that it's also at odds with the continued existence of the species at all, right? And so like as for myself as a philosopher, I try as much as I am able to model that aspect of what I see as Marx's contribution and what he has to model about how to engage with philosophical questions, that he's not doing it from the standpoint of like, you know, I'm a really smart guy, I read a bunch of Hegel, I'm sure I can figure this out. No, you know, he's looking outward and he's asking, what can the world teach them? I'm trying to answer these questions. What's out here that can help me? Who's out here that can help me? And how can I align myself with them? You know, with the side that, as he says, has the future in its hands. And I think so the discipline that I engage with most often, aside from my own disciplinary home, is history. I basically think good philosophy and good history are the same damn thing. And I think that for for reasons that make sense, you know, given the man of the hour, right? That understanding something about the movement of people attempting to live in this world, that is the guide. And so that's, anyway, I'll stop there, but that's how I try to do it.
Fantastic. So I guess we'll move on to the audience questions. There's loads of them, inevitably. I like this one from Balaam, which came in earlier, which I guess I'll put to Paul because of its focus on capital, but it mentions that in Wendy Brown's foreword to the new translation, which you put out, she offers an argument for why Marx is a philosopher, specifically because capital is a prime philosophical object, requiring in its complexity novel and powerful philosophical tools and methodologies. So I suppose maybe capital is simply a work of conceptual analysis. Is that the idea?
I don't know if I would go that far, but I certainly think Wendy is right. And Marx did too. I think right now the most compelling argument for Marx as a philosopher, you know, 30 or 40 years ago, someone might say it was Althusser's argument that Marx invented a new object of knowledge, capitalism, and a new kind of way of doing knowledge. But now I think it's an Italian philosopher, Roberto Finelli. And what Finelli argues is that later in life, when he was doing political economy, the critique of political economy, finally figuring out how to do it, which took him at least a decade and probably more, he switched his object of interest from something like alienation and a philosophy of praxis to what Finelli calls, following a tradition, real abstraction. And he thinks that what Marx discovers about capital, why it's so damn violent and dominating, why it leads to wretchedness and a big division among the world's populations and their access to the goods of the world, is that it drains concreteness out of human relations, out of things, and out of labor. And all of our activities are really controlled by mainly abstract labor. Labor as a thing we have to live up to do something as fast as it needs to be done, to bring our labor up to the general abstraction of labor in the society, how much it needs to do. Because capital makes abstractions, it is a consummately philosophical operation. You can think it. And any other society and sociality might be a total mess. There might be 100 different ways of doing things that all live happily together, and something like philosophy, which likes to have categories, would make no sense. You'd be like, over here we're doing it this way, over there they're doing it that way, and down here they've got a totally different way. But capital is a kind of homogenizing, abstracting force, and philosophy is the way to get at it. So I'm just adding to Wendy's view that because it's so complex and subtle, you need something like philosophical thought. I think also Marx would say, because it produces this strange object, the commodity, which carries this totally abstracted substance value. You have to do something like philosophy to recognize the highly unreal contents of this social system.
Can I?
Yes, please, Sandro.
I just want to say about, I haven't read Wendy's Brown introduction or preface to the new translation, but from what Paul is saying, it comes to my mind two very important works of 20th century Marxism. One is from Ginrich Seleny, this Czech Marxist who has this book that calls The Logic of Capital, I guess in English. And the other one is from Felipe Martinez Marzois, an Spanish philosopher. And both of them, it's very interesting, because both of them try to go out from these two positions that I was trying to put in the table. This about this argument about if Marx is philosopher or is not a philosopher, and they actually try to a little bit as in the same as Goldman. They try to develop how actually capital can be read as a book, as a book that it's that can be seen in the canon of philosophical discourse, not just because Marx used philosophical tools to develop the theory of commodity fetishism, or because the concept of alienation is very important or whatever. No, more because of what Paul was saying. Like, for example, for Marzois, Marx is in Capital, he's developing an ontology, an historical ontology of the use value as commodity, of the objects as commodity, for example. No, but at the same time, they try to not to lose sight, like again, the self-conception of Marx, of what he was doing. Because I don't know if you guys are agree, but from my point of view, if we see the self-conception of Marx, and we have some texts where he, as we know in the preface to the contribution and in another essays, he is very clear, no? Like, he's going from the critique of the philosophy from the critique of this field to trying to develop, to form a new kind of scientificity that it's not all, that it's neither bourgeois scientificity, no, but this is this specific critical scientificity for the communist discourse, no. So yeah, I mean, there's also I don't know, it came to my mind from what you guys were talking about, Wendy Brown. Like Marzois develops this reading of capital as an ontology of commodity in a very systematic philosophical way. And another thing that I want to say, that I already said, but I think we should not lose from sight, is that this attitude towards philosophy, like to overcome, to abolish philosophy, to overcome philosophy, it not just come from Marx. It's something that comes from philosophical discourse in itself, no? So that talk us about some kind of fatigue of traditional philosophical discourse, no? That Heidegger saw it, Wittgenstein saw it, and a lot of philosophers, from their own standpoints, they were not doing philosophy anymore, because for a lot of people who works in the field of philosophy, the traditional form that takes this discourse is just like, how you say, perish, like yeah, like it has come to an exhaustion, no, to a decline. Yeah.
Super. Well, we've got about 5, maybe 10 minutes left. So there's a broad-ranging question from Gregory, which I thought we could all end the session by discussing. So Gregory asked, with the emergence of, well, he lists fascism in the US, the US-Israeli genocide in Gaza, Trump's attempt to restructure global trade, the international flow of capital, what do you think are the most pressing praxis-related activities for Marxist philosophers at this historical juncture? So it's a question about the present and the future, and it's pretty big, and Paul's kind of making some kind of face gestures. So why don't we start with you? We're gonna put it on to you, Paul, to start with that.
Shit. I guess I would go for finance. I think that's what we have to do. There are some good theories of finance, even going back 100 years, but it hasn't really entered into the mainstream of Marxist thinking, which tends to be about production. If 60% of the world economy is finance, and if politics has become about this other issue too, it's been influenced by it, has finance people moving in and out of governments, I think we really need to understand how that changes the potentials for action. What would it mean to have a revolutionary, not, I don't mean just a left or a center left like George Soros character, but what would it mean to have a revolutionary finance company? From that kind of crazy question, I also think to some degree there should be a Marxist revolutionary push to convince the capitalists that capitalism is bad for them too. So this is all in the zone of what you do when a lot of the economy seems to have been taken out of the hands of workers. Not that there aren't still 2 billion productive workers in the world, but the control of economic things doesn't seem to be such now that a worker uprising would have the same effect. What happens if we start from the other end?
Thanks. I guess I assumed that finance was well understood, but it probably isn't. It's one of those sort of broad terms. Maybe I thought that capital itself was a. Anyway, doesn't matter what I think. The point is that that world is completely alien to me because
So
of its
just to
complexity. That world of.
to put two sentences on it, capital for Marx was industrial capital mainly, which was money that went into production, went through production, was realized on a market, came back with the more that was added by workers' unpaid labor, and then was reinvested to expand production. Credit, which is as far as he got really in thinking about finance, supported that, could give a loan to productive capital in order to get started or to expand before the money came back around. But to have so many financial instruments, so many bets, one on top of the other, on top of the other, to make up the majority of the movement of money in the world today was something that he didn't see.
Brilliant. Well, that's definitely something to think about. For the philosopher, at least, we could try and do an issue on finance. I don't know who would put it together, but we can at least think about it. Sandro, do you have any response to Gregory's initial question or Paul's response to it?
I didn't catch the question. Can you?
Sure, yeah. So basically, the main nub of it is, what do you think are the most pressing praxis-related activities for Marxist philosophers at this historical juncture? Big question.
Yeah, no, I don't really have an opinion right now. Like, very hard question to answer.
Vanessa, then over to you for the denouement, final moment of the conversation.
Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah. No, I mean, this is, I'm sure I don't have to tell anyone in attendance at this webinar, this is a terrifying moment in the US. And one of the things right off the bat that I notice is voices getting quieter. People who were loud and at the forefront of various demands, let's say especially within the last 5 years, sort of building on the incredible momentum of the 2020 protests and uprisings associated with Black Lives Matter, and also with demands to defund or even abolish the police, that gave birth to a renewed vigor and interest in radical solutions to our pressing and stubborn social, economic, and political problems in the U.S. And I notice many voices getting quieter and quieter and quieter. And it's not hard to understand why. There are two major drivers of that. And one is some folks are just absolutely backs against the wall. Students and faculty and activists of all stripes that were involved, especially last spring, in the encampment protests to compel the U.S. to stop its engineering and authorizing of the genocide in Gaza. Those folks are fighting criminal charges and trying to get reinstated at their universities, and probably just dealing with the trauma. They're probably just tired and traumatized. And then you also have the other second driver, closely related, which is just absolute terror at what may lie ahead of us. And I think that there is especially given the way that academia works in the United States, or less and less so. I'm talking about the tenure track, which is already such a small percentage of jobs even are tenure track or tenured. But it acculturates people into a practice of biting their tongue, of saving the controversial statements for later. So save it for after you get your PhD. Save it for after you get that tenure track job. Oh my God, just hold tight a few more years. You got to get through third year review. And then eventually, once you get tenure, then you can speak. But don't forget, you still got to try to make full, and it's a very, it is a very conservatizing way of inducting people into the professoriate. And that is if you have a tenure track job, and if you're not someone who's being hired on multiple 2 or 3 year contracts, or God forbid, semester to semester, right? And so I think, the question is, what does praxis look like in this moment for philosophers? And I think that it is very important for all of us to shake ourselves out of the habit of waiting to say something later, because the time is now. I think it is very clearly now, or possibly never. And when we look at, I've been giving talks all around the country over the last several months, and I've never in my, I've been in academia like 20 years. So that includes grad school, but like I have never seen such a feeling of dread that is just universal. And when, academic freedom was already very much under attack 20 years ago, as it was 2010, I think, that ethnic studies was banned in Arizona. And a lot of us on the coasts, in particular in the US, a lot of us in elite spaces we're saying, yeah, I don't know, Arizona, red state, weird, they're weird down there, and now look at the progress that has been made on the side of evil, I think, in my professional opinion as a moral philosopher. And now, like I was at Yale a couple of weeks ago, I was at, like you go around and you go to even like elite universities, places where you expect the vibe to be everybody's feeling pretty good. Yes, they know that there's some trouble, but are generally like feeling confident. And that's not the vibe. You go to the most like elite spaces, and they're under attack. And I think, in terms of praxis, in terms of what can we do, like if you have been calling for social justice, if you have been doing work that unabashedly and without apology picks a side in a struggle between the oppressed and their oppressors, keep doing it. If you've been waiting, now's the time. I'm telling you, now is the time to say it, to get involved with activists in your community, to see what people at your universities are doing, to connect with other radical scholars, to let your colleagues know that you're a weird radical. Like, now is the time to do that work. There may not be a later.